Writing Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices.
Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome to Writing Out Loud. My very special guest today is Hannibal Johnson. We're going to be talking about Hannibal's new book, Tulsa's Historic Greenwood District. Thank you for being here, Hannibal.
Oh, it's great to be here again.
Let's go back in time. May 31st, 1921. What are some of the most common misconceptions about what happened in the Greenwood District that evening?
I think one of the more common misconceptions is that the Greenwood community was obliterated, never to rise again. And fundamentally, the story of the Greenwood District as a community is the story of the human spirit. It's really about the character of a people who were visionaries and were able to build something quite remarkable, Black Wall Street, an entrepreneurial mecca here in Tulsa, that was devastated by the 1921 Tulsa race riot, but rebuilt, actually to a substantially better degree after the destruction and devastation of the riot.
Give us a sense of what Greenwood was like prior to the riots.
Greenwood was a really bustling community, again known as the Black Wall Street of America, or the Negro Wall Street of America, solely due to its entrepreneurial character, the concentration of entrepreneurs, from anything from professionals to concentrations of lawyers and doctors and pharmacists and so forth, to shop owners, to movie theaters, dance halls, all manner of small business enterprise and service industry was prevalent in the Greenwood of old.
You make a statement in the book that many of the Greenwood entrepreneurs had actually learned how to make the Jim Crow laws work to their advantage. How could that be?
Well, this was an isolated, insular economy. So the dollars circulated and recirculated within the confines of that economy. And ironically, one of the things that caused the second demise of the Greenwood community was integration, because dollars began to flow outside the community. The service providers and businesses inside the community were unable to compete because of things like economies of scale after integration. And so the financial foundation of the community was undermined by integration. When you have segregation, ironically, you have an insular, trapped economy. And so those dollars have to go somewhere, and they stay within the confines of that community. And that actually benefited, in a financial way, the Greenwood community of old.
Not only was Greenwood referred to as the Black Wall Street, it was regarded as a kind of mecca. What had become of that mecca 24 hours into the riots?
The riot totally obliterated Greenwood. It wiped out roughly a 35 square block area. And the riot itself lasted a period of roughly 16 hours, the night of May 31st through mid-morning of June 1st. And so in the wake of the riot, we know that some 1,250 businesses and homes were destroyed. We know that somewhere between 100 and 300 people lost their lives. We know that many people were displaced. We know that members of the African American community were interned, very much like people of Japanese ancestry were interned during World War II. And we know that many African American individuals and families spent days, weeks, months, up to a year in tent cities sponsored by the Red Cross, which provided a lot of the riot relief effort.
I want you to talk a little bit more about the internment, because a lot of people aren't aware of that.
Well, essentially, people in the black community were rounded up during the riot after the relief came in from the National Guard, and they were taken to various centers around town, the fairgrounds, for example, and they were essentially imprisoned, and the rationale ostensibly was that this was a way of protecting them from harm. But in practical effect, what it did was to leave the black community defenseless. So you had African American citizens, mostly men, but some women and children as well, in these encampments. And most of them were only able to get out after having had a white person, a white Tulsan, vouch for them and sort of relieve them from the confines of the camp.
How prominent was the KKK in Oklahoma at that time?
That's a really interesting question, because we know that the KKK rises to prominence in the 20s, but primarily the late 20s after the riot. But we know that there is evidence that the Klan was present during the riot. And again, the Klan grew enormously in Oklahoma toward the end of the 1920s. And we also know that many prominent Tulsans in the 1920s were affiliated with the Klan. We know that because McFarland Library out at the University of Tulsa maintains rosters for the Klan. The roster for 1921 is not available, but rosters for later years in the 20s are in fact available. When you go look at those rosters, you find a number of prominent individuals. They're listed with name, street address, profession. And I think people are stunned to see that there are preachers and school teachers and all manner of people from all walks of life in Tulsa society affiliated with the Klan, because essentially it was a sort of badge of honor and patriotism at the time.
It's hard to imagine, isn't
It is. It is.
I wanted to ask you about a rumor that's persisted for years that a bomb was actually dropped on the community during the riots. What does your research tell you?
That is a question that will never be fully answered to anyone's satisfaction. There are a couple of things that we do know. We do know that there were planes that flew over the Greenwood community during and after the riot. We do know that those planes were almost certainly privately or commercially owned and not military planes. We do know that the official version is that those planes were on reconnaissance missions. They were looking, surveying the area to see what was going on. We do know that there are a number of eyewitnesses who say that those planes, in fact, dropped incendiary devices on the Greenwood community that caused the fires to burn more quickly. But we'll never know with certainty whether the eyewitness statements are accurate or the official version is accurate. We do know that, again, that the planes in fact flew over the community, though.
Most historical accounts point to the encounter in the elevator as the inciting incident. What really happened on the elevator? Will we ever know?
I'm glad you used the term inciting incident, because that really is an appropriate term. The elevator incident was the trigger, but it wasn't the fundamental underlying cause of the riot. The causes of the riot, I think, are much more complex and much more systemic. The causes of the riot include things like the overall racial climate, not just in Tulsa, but in the United States more generally. Historians and sociologists call this period in our history the nadir of race relations in America, the low point in race relations, because there were lynchings and all manner of oppression of African American citizens during this period. So that was no different here in Tulsa than it was in other places throughout the United States. The 1921 Tulsa race riot comes on the heels of a major outbreak of these civil disturbances throughout the United States. 1919, more than 25 so-called race riots throughout the United States in places like Chicago and Washington, D.C., Longview, Texas, and on and on and on, Omaha. So this was sort of a movement throughout the country. The Greenwood District, geographically, essentially abuts downtown Tulsa and sits on some very valuable property. And we know that a number of industrialists and business people wanted the land on which the Greenwood community sat. So that's part of it. It's sort of covetousness over the land. We also know that during this period, African Americans were considered, in some circles, less than full individuals, less than full citizens. And so there was a certain amount of jealousy over the business success and the money that was flowing in Greenwood. So we have all these sort of things going on which essentially creates a tinderbox that just needs something to ignite it. The ignition happened to be an elevator incident between a white girl, Sarah Page, 17 years old, and a black boy, Dick Rowland, 19 years old. Dick Rowland shining shoes one day, Monday, May 30th, 1921. He needed to use the restroom. There was a nearby building called the Drexel Building that had an available facility. Facilities were segregated, of course. Sarah Page was manually operating the elevator. Dick Rowland boards the elevator. Something happens on the elevator during the ride that causes Dick Rowland to bump into or brush up against Sarah Page. Sarah Page screams. The elevator lands back down the lobby. Sarah Page flees the elevator. Dick Rowland is in pursuit. Sarah Page encounters a clerk from a locally owned store called Renberg's. He assists her. Sarah Page ultimately decides that she will not cooperate in the prosecution of Dick Rowland. But before all that transpires, the press gets hold of this really inflammatory story. And the next day, which would be May 31st, the local afternoon newspaper called the Tulsa Tribune reported on the incident. But the reportage was such that the incident was characterized as an attempted rape in broad daylight in a public building in our fair city. Now, if any reader looks at that story and believes it, you can understand how they might be disturbed or upset if that actually did transpire. Unfortunately, that's not what transpired. So it created a sort of mob mentality that resulted in enormous tension and hostility that ultimately was meted out on the Greenwood community. And the Greenwood community ended up
Not only, Hannibal, are we confounded by the devastation, but also the cover-up that followed. How could the voices of so many victims be silenced like they were? How is that possible? It couldn't happen today, I don't think, with all of our media.
It's very interesting. I think that there are a number of things going on that led to the relative silence. Some people call it a conspiracy of silence after the riot. The riot was reported in the national press to some extent. But there were, I think we can agree, affirmative efforts to tamp down the story from local business leaders. Why would that be? That would be because Tulsa during this period is a really booming city because of the discovery of oil, becoming the oil capital of the world. This is a stain on that reputation. So for public relations reasons, it makes sense for the business leadership to minimize the story. I think a number of other things were going on as well, psychological dynamics, fear. I think people in the black community were afraid that this could recur.
Right.
I think some upstanding white citizens were ashamed. They didn't want to talk about it because of shame. I think there was a certain amount in both communities of what we call today PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder.
Of course.
So you have all these psychological and social, economic dynamics going on that make it rational at some level for there to be a minimization of this horrific event.
How did you first learn about the riots?
Well, I moved here in the mid '80s and started writing an editorial column for the Oklahoma Eagle. Oklahoma Eagle is the successor to the Tulsa Star, which was the black newspaper that existed during the 1921 Tulsa race riot. I was asked at one point to do a series on the Greenwood District and with a focus on the 1921 Tulsa race riot. I did a 4-part series. I became really interested, wanted to know more. There wasn't really a lot out there at the time.
Were you shocked?
I really was, because I would like to think that I knew a little bit about American history generally, and this is, by the way, this is not a Tulsa story. This is classic American history. It needs to be in every American history textbook. But I grew up in Fort Smith, Arkansas, and I was not aware that this had happened.
I grew up in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, and I wasn't aware that it had happened. Your book takes place in 4 distinct sections: Roots, Riot, Regeneration, and Renaissance. Why is that progression so important to the overall points you want to make?
I find that a lot of people fixate on the riot. So it's the
Sure.
it's the fixation on the negative. And the way that I look at these events is you can't fully understand the gravity of the riot unless you understand what the riot did to the community. So the riot is part of the story, but it is not the story itself. It is an event in the context of the life of a community. And what's important for us to know about is the community. The event, that particular event is secondary. It's important, but it's secondary. You got to understand the damage wrought by the riot. You can't understand that unless you understand the community that it destroyed.
In your life, you've had the honor of getting to know some of the people who actually survived the riots, and I thought you might tell us about some of the ones featured in the book and the lessons that we can learn from them. First of all, Vernice Sims.
You know, there's so many riot survivors, many of whom are no longer with us. But Vernice Sims is a woman who sort of missed her prom because of the riot, and was able many years later to be able to attend that event at historic Booker T. Washington High School. There's Otis Clark, who died a couple of years ago at 100 and I can't get this right, either 108 or 109.
Wow.
And he was remarkably healthy and mentally agile up until the latter part of his life. In fact, he was driving, I think, up until he was about 100 years old, which is kind of a frightening thought for some of us. But
it is.
Yeah, but these are remarkable people who, by and large, were not bitter. They were not bitter.
That's what's amazing to me.
I don't think I talked to any of them who were bitter about the events. What they wanted most of all was for this to be recorded in history, for their stories to be known and be given the kind of importance that they thought they deserve. They wanted people to understand that things like this can, and in fact have, happened, and to be alert for that, and to think about how we can prevent such calamities from happening in the future.
Do you think we're any closer to coming up with that kind of understanding when we'll know how to prevent this sort of thing? It's hard.
That's a tough question.
Because this has been a hard year in America, or last year, 2014. Ferguson.
Yeah. My concern is that I don't think we have the collective will to do the work that's necessary on an ongoing basis to create the trust and positive human relations that are necessary to avoid these sorts of events. We are so conditioned to instantaneous gratification. We want to identify a problem, solve it, and move on to the next problem. In terms of race and generally human relations, you don't solve the problem. You continually work at it. You develop relationships and you build trust so that things don't get so far out of hand. But you can't prevent every incident. There will be conflict, almost by definition, when you talk about human relations. The question is, how do you resolve the conflict? And if you don't have intimate relationships, and if you haven't built trust with people, particularly people who are different from you, then you risk having these huge blow-ups on a recurring basis.
At the end of the book, you include some very powerful statements from survivors. No word from Dick Rowland or Sarah Page. Do we know what happened to them?
That is something that is a curiosity for a whole lot of folks. I don't think we know much about either of them. We do know that Dick Rowland ended up leaving Tulsa. He was safe. He was not harmed in any way. Went to Kansas City and ultimately went to the West Coast. I think, if I'm correct, he was in either Washington or Oregon on the West Coast, and he died there, as I recall, in a shipyard accident. Don't know much about Sarah Page, so it would be interesting to know something about their fates. But it is particularly interesting that neither of them were harmed in any way.
No. If you could go back and ask Dick Rowland one question, what would it be? Besides, did you do something? What would you want to ask him?
That is an interesting question. I think I might want to know something about his relationship with Sarah Page, because there are a lot of folks who have suggested over the years that this was not purely a fortuitous incident, that there was some sort of relationship between the two of them prior to the elevator incident. And I would kind of like to have an answer to that question.
And I imagine you would ask Sarah pretty much that same question.
Absolutely, absolutely.
The producer Nancy Miller is doing a mini-series about Greenwood that's going to appear on the OWN network, and we should emphasize it's historical fiction. Your thoughts?
I actually met with her team when she was here. I have to admit that I had a little bit of concern about the historical fiction angle.
Yeah, I wondered.
So I guess I'd want to know from her how much history, how much fiction. It's the proportionality that matters to me. I understand that sometimes it's important to use some fictional devices to be able to tell a story that's compelling, that grabs viewers and so forth. But in my mind, the history is already compelling without addition. So I'm going to reserve judgment until I see it. I know that she has a great reputation. She's done some great work, so I expect it to be a wonderful product. And I hope that what it will do is encourage people to learn the history, because it can pique people's interest and encourage them to go out and buy the historical information, get the historical information about the event.
Because I wonder, I mean, as someone who's read several different books on Greenwood and done some research myself, nothing like what you have done, but can any one book, any one film tell the complete story of what happened?
Well, I think you raised an interesting question about history generally.
Yeah, well, there you go. That's right.
So the real question is there a single truth? And I think the answer to that is absolutely not. It's important to look at multiple perspectives. One of the things I like so much about the late Professor Howard Zinn, you're familiar with Howard Zinn, is his notion of, his most famous book is A People's History of the United States. So it tells the history of the United States from the perspective, often, of the vanquished and not the victors. It's the same events told from a different lens, through a different lens. So I think my perspective on these events as a black male person is at least slightly different from Scott Ellsworth, for example, who's a friend of mine. Scott Ellsworth's view of these events as a white male person with a different vantage. And that doesn't mean either one of them's more or less valid than the other. I think we need to look at all of them.
You've written other books on Greenwood, The Black Wall Street, Up from the Ashes. What keeps you going, Hannibal? What are you looking for? Are you looking for inspiration, resolution, answers?
I think all the above. I love history, and I love learning how history can be relatable and relevant to the present. And I think it's absolutely true that a lot of the mistakes we make today are born of our ignorance about our own history, about our own past. And so my goal is to discover some of that past and, as best I can, in my own little way, share that with other people.
You mentioned that the survivors have not expressed bitterness, but I wonder, when you go back and read these atrocious things that happened, how do you combat feelings of bitterness?
I certainly experience anger, but bitterness is ultimately not productive. That's I have to keep going back to that point. Ultimately, it does nothing but sort of eat at you. It doesn't really do anything to anybody else, to your perceived enemies. It really hurts you. So you have to let that go and figure out how you can leverage the past, good, bad, and otherwise, to make you a better person, to make the world a better place in the present.
In Up from Ashes, you view the Greenwood tragedy through a young boy. I wonder what you're trying to say to future generations.
Well, what I found is that kids understand the major concepts in this history. So if you put it on, like up from the ashes, a third grade reading level, then kids can understand things like brotherhood, community. They can understand, right and wrong, sort of the morality of the situation. They articulate it in ways that are different, but they get the core messages. These people were mean to or unfair to these other people. Why did that happen? This shouldn't be the way that we behave with respect to one another. They get it.
Yeah.
And it's important that they get it at an early age.
And maybe they can teach us.
Right, absolutely.
Let's imagine if May 31st, 1921 hadn't happened, how would Greenwood have evolved? What might have been?
Even though the Greenwood community was obliterated in the 1921 Tulsa race riot, it rose up from the ashes and became bigger and better. It actually peaked in around 1942. So we also know that 4 years after the riot, in 1925, Tulsa hosted the National Negro Business League's National Conference. The National Negro Business League was essentially the black chamber of commerce started by Booker T. Washington. That annual conference was here in Tulsa 4 years after the riot. It was held here in part as a show of confidence in Tulsa's ability to rebuild. But it's also a testament to the people who were here and their ability to persevere.
We just got a couple of seconds here. Do you remain hopeful for us as a nation?
Yes, gotta have hope.
I love hearing that. Thank you so much for
Absolutely.
being here, Hannibal. And thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.